People versus technology. It's a big question. You know, at Lyft, we try to have a very pragmatic view on technologies, and we like to celebrate the good sides, and we also like to discuss the issues that technologies bring in our lives. And I wanted to start this conference with this question. Did technology make our lives better or worse, our lives and our organizations? Do we collaborate better? Do we live better? And to open the conference, I challenged one of the great thinkers of new technologies, JP Rangaswamy. There are so many things he does that it's hard for me to summarize it. What you should know is that he's the chief scientist of Salesforce, and you should refer to his Wikipedia page to learn more about him. And I asked him, in your opinion, did technologies make our lives better or worse? He's going to tell us now. Please help me welcome JP Rangaswamy.
Thank you, Laurent.
The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. For reference, in case you need it, I'm Jobsworth on Twitter, and I write at Confused of Calcutta. When Laurent and I were speaking about what I was intending to do here, what he wanted me to do at the start, and asking about how I perceive technology, having been sort of immersed in it for the last 32 years, was it good, was it bad? As I was trying to think through, I was reminded of something that Mahatma Gandhi said when he first visited the West. Okay? The idea that it doesn't naturally expect things to be a good idea. It's only a question of when it happens. So what I thought I'd do is step back a little bit. You're going to hear a lot from people over the next couple of hours, over the next couple of days, about the pros and cons in this debate. I wanted to frame the argument differently, hoping that as a result of that framing, you could view things that come through for the rest of the day and the rest of the conference differently. First and foremost, think about technology as considering a series of inventions and innovations that happen because of certain stimuli. There are two types of stimuli that appear to exist if you follow the works of people like Brian Arthur at Santa Fe. One is that there is a perceived need. So man was able to fly, the propeller engine existed, the plane had been invented, but wanted to fly longer distances. So a need was perceived. To get over that need, something had to happen in order to get that extra distance, that extra fuel efficiency, the implication that you won't get the same air resistance. And so the jet engine was invented. And that's the classic that most people think about when any form of invention is discussed. Necessity is the mother of invention. You find a need, and someone fills that gap. Nature abhors a vacuum. That thinking has permeated a lot of people in thinking about technology. Over the last century, people have come up with a second definition of the stimulus for invention, for the creation of a new technological principle, and that was leveraging an observed effect. Right? That is a close-up of Velcro. And the idea that a man watched a dog run through a field, picking up burrs onto its fur, and then when he got home with the dog, he could take the burrs off with no damage to either surface, with no pain, and yet strongly enough held in between. So the idea of high adhesion with no damage to either surface and no pain in the extraction became valuable and became an observed effect that could be replicated for other purposes. So for quite a long time, these were the two sort of themes of invention, of creating new technology principles. And when we think of them, when we think of technologies changing, you've got to realize what drove the technology to exist in the first place. More recently, a third stimulus has been considered, and that is the stimulus of speeding up evolution. Right? When man discovered fire and the ability to apply fire onto food, that created an external stomach. Pre-digestion was suddenly possible. And as a result of pre-digestion, our stomachs are actually relatively small in comparison to our body size, which has allowed our brains to be somewhat larger for our body size. So as soon as you think of cooking actually as pre-digestion or an external stomach, you see that the technology of cooking allowed us to evolve differently. And when you think about, whether Google's making your brain wire differently, etc., you have to understand the idea of humans engaging with technology and evolving as a response to it has been there a long time. But evolution has different timescales. Technology sometimes exists to speed up evolution. So Kevlar, or wearing a bulletproof vest, if man wanted to grow bulletproof skin or get the ability to have nails as strong as steel, it may take millennia, whereas the creation of Kevlar has happened in a much shorter space of time. So I put it to you that when you think of technology and the reason for new technology principles to exist, before you even decide on the good and the bad, at least consider what was the stimulus that created it. Was it a perceived need? Was it an observed effect? Or was it a wish to speed up evolution? As an economist, I actually bracket this differently. I think of every perceived need as a scarcity. And I think of every observed effect as an abundance. And George Gilder, who was an economist who wrote a lot about this in the 1980s, he stated that the biggest value for a business model is one that can take an economic era's peculiar abundances and peculiar scarcities and then get value out of them, leverage them into the business model. So for each of us, when we're building businesses, we should be thinking, what are the new scarcities? What are the new abundances that exist today? Rather than look and make value judgments about saying everybody's sharing too much, turn around and say there is an abundance of intention and about activity. Say there is a scarcity of privacy. There is a scarcity of attention. There is an abundance of intention. So you start looking at the events of a ubiquitously connected, always-on, smartphone-empowered population as behaving differently from a time when they didn't have those abundances and scarcities, and therefore look at it in those contexts rather than judgmentally saying too much information, why do I want to know what he's doing at 7:43 a.m. or whatever else, right? Saying, as a result of that, what could change in our lives? And all technologies can have good elements and bad elements to it. It's all a perception of how you look at these things. So I then want to move on to saying, before you discard attitudes to do with technology, in order to have the right frame, understand what kind of pioneering took place, what kind of pain took place, right? Some people at one time thought that asbestos was fantastic because of its malleable qualities, the ability to put it in all kinds of materials, and to prevent fire and be heat resistant, etc. We learned differently. There was a time when it was possible to be able to buy cocaine wherever and whenever you felt like. Right? That time is not now, although some people prefer to think that that time continues. But the truth is that if you had a really bad toothache, right, you might prefer to say, I wish I had those pills now. Have we gone forward or back that we can't buy these anymore today? Right? It depends on the quality of your toothache. Okay? Perspective matters in these things. There was a time when doctors and dentists spent a lot of time not just telling you to smoke, but even telling you which brand to use. Okay? This existed. This was normal. So when we start thinking about movements in technology and start making all our calls, let us understand that even in the last 50 years, we have had to make changes. Okay? The amount of time necessary for us to really understand the effects of a technology, right? We are beginning to start reacting to things in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. I know change happens much more quickly, but change has to be looked at in a connected sense, much more holistically. I had the opportunity to listen to a doctor who's got a best-selling book right now called The End of Illness, Dr. David Agus. I met him the last time I was in the US. And, I was born and brought up in Calcutta in India. I spent more than half my life now in the West, 23 years in India, 31 years not in India. And as a result, I guess, I have a peculiar perception of some of these things. But one of the things that I had this peculiar perception of was, allopathic medicine versus homeopathic, holistic ways of treating human health rather than point ways. And what David Agus said, which sort of really made me think, was man used to be treated as one holistic object by medicine until we discovered our ability to fight point diseases. As soon as we knew we could solve a disease, right, that was much easier to do than solving humanity. So we switched. We became not customer-centric, but product-centric in all our thinking, because it was just easier to do. But it was easier to do only for point diseases. So when you look at the chart of what we have seen as health improvements over the last decade, what you'll find over the last 100 years, that things like cancer haven't improved as much compared to the eradication of point diseases, because things that were much more to do with the whole body and balance and imbalance, etc., we weren't concentrating on. So our own reactions at different times start affecting future generations, not just in the technologies we create, but I want you to bear in mind over the rest of the day the technologies we don't create, okay? Because we have responsibilities. Our reactions inform our world, inform capital, inform judgment about what we won't do. And the choosing of what we don't do will have effects downstream as well. Right? There is an opportunity cost to our preferences and our profiles and our emotion in saying, too much sharing is bad, too much this is bad, too much that is bad. You don't get a medal for being able to criticize something. You get a medal for being able to be constructive about the criticism. Okay, we also have to bear in mind that when people pioneer things, I think of somebody as simple as Foursquare as pioneering the ability to attach a label to a GPS location, because labels are needed in GPS locations for us to do so many more things, that these are the people who are mapping the electronic world, okay? Like the people in the 15th and 16th century who started discovering lands and creating maps, we now have people who check in and say, I'm going to add this location, I'm going to add this label, and pioneers pay a price. Sometimes it's ridicule, sometimes like Marie Curie in X-rays, she paid with her life, Jonathan Edwards, who propagated the use of the smallpox vaccine, tried it in order to encourage the people around him and died of the attempt. Okay? Many of the things that we see in use in different technical values have had people who have sacrificed time, energy, money, effort, lives. One of the most beautiful things about the open source movement to me is it is the exact opposite of what people have seen in financial worlds. Okay? In the financial world, what we saw with the last crisis was that losses were socialized and profits were privatized. In open source, it is the exact opposite. If you fail in something you build in the open source community, nobody adopts it. The loss is privatized. If you succeed in the open source community, the whole community adopts it, enriches it, improves it, moves it, propagates it. So that means gains are socialized. And we have to think, therefore, about our roles in how we take technologies, how we deal with the iterations and the losses, and how we deal with the propagations and the gains. Sometimes technology has some unintended consequences. When President Clinton visited India, I think it was in 1996, in 2000 March, his Secret Service apparently asked the Indian government for the right to record everything within a 5-mile radius of where he was. The Indian government said, well, you can do that, we don't have the technology. The Americans said, we have the technology. Indian says, deal, you come here, do it, leave the technology behind. The American said, no, over my dead body. And over time, a compromise was reached where the Secret Service were allowed to do the recording, apparently. It's very hard to get all the details behind this. But the deal, the trade, the compromise was alleged to be that they had to leave the tapes behind. India did not have a labor problem at that time. There was a cognitive surplus of scale at a relatively low price. So people had all the time in the world to listen to those tapes. And as a result of it, cricket's biggest betting ring was exposed. Because somebody said, that's South African cricket captain, that's a big gangster bookmaker in Bombay, and out of someone who had all the time in the world just to listen to mile after mile of tape, this happened. So technology has unintended consequences. When Pakistan banned YouTube because they were concerned about a particular video over there, someone in the ISP decided on a simple, crude HTTP redirect. What they didn't know was that someone not far away in PCCW had written a program to keep looking for the quickest hops to their most popular sites. And the way the HTTP redirect was implemented, it looked like the Pakistani route to nothing was the quickest. So all of PCCW traffic went on. Before you knew it, 40% of the world's YouTube traffic was being directed at a dead page, and Pakistan was being accused of taking down YouTube. Right? Unintended consequences of people making technical actions. We are still learning about how complex adaptive systems work. This is what Kevin Slavin was spending time on and talking about algorithms in the world of algorithms, but even human beings can make errors that then scale out. Most recently, I guess most of you are familiar with the story, but I'm going to tell it for those who aren't. Right? The buying patterns of a 15-year-old girl in terms of what she chose in a supermarket over time were interpreted as a pattern that suggested she was likely to be pregnant. Therefore, the sales and marketing machine sent her offers to do with treating her as pregnant. The father opened the package and said, "What the hell are you guys doing? I mean, do you realize you're sending this to a 15-year-old girl?" And they had no idea why the 15-year-old girl was sent that, because that wasn't part of the decision-making criteria. It was only the buying pattern. And then they investigated, and then the father investigated, and the truth came out. So we will start showing unintended signals, even through the patterns of what we acquire, indicating where we are going, even though we didn't know we were signaling it, because over time, the scale at which those patterns are available gives us signals. Technology sometimes is not even built to speed up. QWERTY was meant to be a short-term solution to slow something down. And yet, when we no longer have any connection whatsoever with the idea of keys on a carriage clashing together, can we get ourselves to change away from QWERTY? The attempts have been made. We won't, we can't. Perhaps we will, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen in my lifetime. I've always looked for the one piece of technology which I've never seen any interest in, any value about, any justification for. And my favorite for that is region coding on a DVD. Okay? If there is one person in this room who believes that true customer value was generated by doing that, please come and see me afterwards. I've been waiting all my life to meet you. Okay? But when you look at technology, understand that pioneers exist, pain has been had, events happen that create quite unusual consequences. Right? Look at it holistically, because we're spending too much time knee-jerking today. Right? We cannot be the Luddites of this century. We cannot, it may be true that when the car was invented, it was a bit of a problem because you lived where you worked, so the suburb had to be invented to give you a reason to drive away. Okay? And that created the unintended consequence of having a downtown which grew dark and empty when nobody was there when work finished. Whereas if you have multi-use dwellings, there is no downtown because where you live is where you work. So, was it the car that did it? Was it our wish to aspire towards the life that the car and the suburb led? Who knows? But you have to understand there will always be positives and negatives coming out. Right? Television was meant to create that, and maybe it did, but I've yet to meet a person who looks like that. This is meant to make us dumb, right? But when I see my children, and I have children of 26, 20, and nearly 14, I don't see them as being dumb. I see them as being quite different. I see their ability to find information out as being different, and I do not see a complete lack of attention. What I see is that they have so many routes to attention that they need to have better filtering. It's the Clay Shirky, I don't have information overload, I have filter failure. And people are using social networks as a basis for filtering. So when you look at the social network and all the time spending, understand that they have attention, not attention deficit disorders as much as so much competing brands for their attention, that they need help to be able to figure out what are the important. Signal versus noise has existed forever and a day. So again, before we push back, we need to think. Right? People always told me people with a second life don't have a first life. But all the studies suggest that the super communicators of the new generation spend more time in face-to-face interaction. They use social networks to augment their analog interactions and not to substitute it. But we, who are not part of that generation, start worrying about, oh, they just sit next to each other and they won't even talk to each other. We make up stories as to how a generation we do not belong to behaves. And there's always, people willing to, I love Randall Munroe, so if I find a reason to stick an XKCD comic piece, I will. Technology allows Stephen Hawking to have had a voice and to have been able to communicate to us. That matters to me. I feel it should matter to you guys as well. That while there may be many, many negatives, think about the enfranchising that technology does in its different forms when you think of anything to do with this kind of world. Right? Oscar Pistorius is allowed to be able to run as a result. Right? Again, it may sound insane if you weren't part of it, but the idea that people who have loss of limb are able to recreate anything that looks like that kind of mobility is worth remembering and worth understanding. I understand from Laurent that Sugata Mitra spoke here a few years ago, so you're aware of minimally invasive education, but the idea that children learn rather than get taught, that you can discover without manuals, without teachers, just with a relatively old PC stuck on a wall, how the world works, that you can educate yourself. The shift from teaching back to learning is so, so important. It's like moving to the holistic body. One of my favorite projects of all time, and it'll always tell me when I start feeling cynical or worried or frustrated about technology, is the photo rescue project in Tohoku. Okay? When just about a year ago, in March last year, there was the earthquake and the tsunami in Japan, many lives were lost, a lot of property was damaged, but one of the things that was damaged potentially irreparably was that of, I nearly went there, potentially irreparably. Laurent warned me, but I got carried away. One of the things that got damaged was memories. Right? Lots of photographs that were stored up by the people who lived in the Fukushima area, water damaged, apparently beyond repair. And someone came up with the idea of saying, why don't we scan all those photographs in, make it available to the world at large, and allow human beings anywhere in the world to use their Photoshop skills to recreate those damaged photographs so that the memories are brought back. Okay? I don't care which school you went to, what value you want to have, the fact that human beings still have that altruistic ability to sit and give of their time just to be able to help somebody else's memories in situations of such stress, that makes me want to, stand up and cry. Because that is what starts making technology all worthwhile. I have a pacemaker. I've got, 200,000, I don't know how many $1,000s worth of equipment inside me and miles of wire and everything else. I know that having had a number of heart attacks, I wouldn't be alive here without the advent of medical technology. I wouldn't be here speaking to you. My children wouldn't have a father who's alive. And hearing that they now have designed a pill that can be navigated from outside, which has a remote camera that can capture everything you do in the body, it's like a submersible pill. And it's about the size of a normal pill. It has a full, remotely driven back camera. It's just amazing to me because I have watched, I've had a number of operations where I've been able to watch. I bring all this together as the opening keynote only for one reason and one reason alone. Technology itself does not make things good or bad in terms of the answer to Laurent's question. It is the engagement with human beings that can make it good or bad. We choose. We decide. We are still masters. And when we decide, we have to understand pioneers pay a price. Some of those prices are tragic. consequences can be unintended, and some of them can be comic. That these are interactive rather than point. And I would leave you and end this session with repeating the view that every economic era has its unique, its peculiar abundances, and its peculiar scarcities. Today, the abundances and scarcities we speak of are known and are driven by the existence of the social network, of ubiquitous connectivity, of empowered people with devices to be able to talk to each other in ways that were not possible, to congregate, to form groups in ways that were not possible. And the whole of what I do at work is to seek to understand how we can create business value from this consumer power, from this empowerment, from these abundances. And we have to look at the scarcities as well. What does it mean to have pressure on privacy? What does it mean to have pressure on attention? And if we understand everything we do in those contexts, then we have the opportunity to use this technology to make our health better, to make our education better, to make our welfare better. And really, that's the reason I'm interested in technology, to live a better life. With that, thank you for your time and have a good conference.